Okay, it's noon, so I'd like to welcome everybody to Constitution Day. Our presenter today is Dr. Zara Moss. She will be presenting on the people of the United States. Thank you for coming, and hopefully if you're watching live, you will get something out of this presentation also.
Awesome. Thanks, April. So this is the third time that I've given this Constitution Day talk, and I try and kind of build on a talk that I've given previously. So the first time was about, it was called like Show Your Mettle, and it was about the founding fathers and the argument for a constitution. Then the second time was about First Amendment rights and Supreme Court cases and like how people use the Constitution as a way to get the things that they want. And so this third time when I was thinking about Constitution Day, I was like, oh my gosh, how can I make this interesting? Like, how can we talk about the Constitution? And everywhere I looked, there was some discussion about personal freedoms, personal rights, and the Constitution. And I thought, oh, this is because we're living in a pandemic world. And most of us that have like the access to social media, we weren't alive like during other pandemics. So it's kind of created this whole nother culture of people using the Constitution as a way of saying kind of like, these are my civil rights, these are my civil liberties, and questioning like the constitutionality of the world that we live in right now. So I was like, this is what I'm going to talk about. And people are like, oh, I don't know if you should. Well, we're going to. So buckle up, everyone. It's going to be really good. So I labeled this the people of the United States, constitutionality in a pandemic-ridden world, because I really feel like a lot of people talk about the Constitution nowadays, and they talk about personal freedoms and arguments between like federal and state governments. And I thought, oh, this will be perfect. It's so delicious. So to start, I thought, everybody should know, but if you don't, we can like backtrack and rewind. So the Constitution essentially was a resolution that was put into effect during the War for Independence when we had like 13 colonies that were trying to gain independence from Great Britain. And then it was passed at a constitutional convention in 1787. And then the first 10 amendments or changes to that original Constitution were passed in 1791. And those we know today are does anybody know? The first 10 amendments to the Constitution? The Bill of Rights, yes. And they start with freedom of speech and religion. Yes, very good, yeah. I always like to, you know how you guys like pump me up when I know things? I like to pump you guys up because you guys know things too. So it's super fun. So what was the original purpose of the Constitution? Well, originally what we aimed to do was to add legitimacy to kind of like a nascent, like newborn nation. And the idea was if we have laws and rules in order, people will take us seriously. And people are like, do you really think that's true? Yes, I do. It's kind of like when you move out of your house, your parents like to hear that you have a plan for like what you're going to do. And they ask you, what's your 3-year plan? What's your 5-year plan? Well, the Constitution was really a way for people back in the day to say like, take us seriously, invest in us, trade with us. We do have a purpose and an order for like what's going to happen here. And it essentially structured the government. So this is where we get this idea of like a central government and then authority within that government and then the structure of that authority. So that's where we get the idea of checks and balances, and a legislative body, executive body, and a judicial body. All of that comes from, in essence, like the framing of the Constitution. What order are we going to have? And when we have this Constitution, then we have to decide, like, what powers is it going to grant the people? Because essentially we're trying to get away from tyrannical empire, right? Like we want to get away from Great Britain and them imposing all these rules on American colonists. And so the structure of the Constitution decides that we're going to kind of like create a weakened central government, but it still has federal powers. But then we're also going to create, in essence, like states' powers, like so the people, depending on where you are and what you do, you can kind of like determine the rule of law that works best for you. So we think of it like an umbrella. We have this overarching federal government that oversees what we do as a nation, the whole. And then we have these states governments that govern over the specific needs of the people who live in different areas. I think that's a really simplistic way to explain it, but it makes sense. So when I was thinking about the Constitution and living in a kind of like throughout this pandemic, I think that the constitutional amendment that most people kind of invoke when they're talking about things related to the pandemic are, of course, like you'll hear some people say, it's about like civil liberties. It's about freedom of speech. It's about the way that I can express my thoughts and ideas and live my life. And when it came down to it, though, I saw that there was a lot of contention between the demands of like the federal government and the way that we want to keep people safe as a whole, as a unit, and then the rights of the states. And so I thought that the 10th Amendment was like a really good way to explore and define this kind of like people versus people, right? So how do we see the federal government trying to take care of like the nation, and then states governments trying to say, okay, but this is what works best for the people who live here. Okay, so this is kind of what I was thinking of, and I want you guys to like nod or be like, yeah, or you get me or you don't. I don't know. It's just a way that I thought I'd interpret this. So the 10th Amendment basically says that any powers that are not delegated to the federal government through the constitutions, but are not prohibited by the states, are reserved to states' powers. That is to say that if there is an issue that the Constitution doesn't explicitly cover, then it is up to the states in order to provide the governance to explore what's in the best interest and welfare of the people. This is how I was like, oh, yes, pandemic. This is where we go. So what does constitutionality have to do with us as we're living through this pandemic? Well, I thought for everybody, it's a little bit different, but I can just like pose it real quickly. So like, what does the Constitution have to do with COVID-19? And very quickly, like people might be able to give me an example of the way that people either invoke the Constitution or they talk about constitutionality when we're talking about the pandemic. So can anybody tell me like real quick, like what's one example of something that you've heard that somebody says and you're like, oh, either my rights, my liberties. Has anybody heard? Okay, so like mask mandates, perfect. Vaccination, awesome. Anybody else? There's been like a ton of ways. Small business ownership, movement of people, stay-at-home orders. There's so many different ways that people have invoked like questioning the constitutionality during the pandemic. Like everybody suddenly is a scholar of the Constitution. Whereas like in the beginning, nobody really, like you memorize the first couple of lines and you're like, oh yeah, I know so much. No. Like, I just think it's really, really fascinating that, I love it. I want everyone to kind of like have this knowledge of the Constitution and be really avid kind of like historians of our nation. But I also want people to be informed and to make like correct assumptions and really educate themselves about what we're saying. So when it comes to what the Constitution has to do with the pandemic and coronavirus, we see that there is like this outright competition between what we see in the news media and what we see on social media. And I just like put like a couple of pictures to give you guys an example of like the ways that I see news media coverage in like periodicals or big networks like CNN, BBC, ABC, MSNBC, like all of them have a lot of coverage when it comes to coronavirus and the pandemic and how it's affected the populations here in the United States. But then we also see it a lot on social media. Like I can't even begin to tell you how many Facebook Lives or Facebook posts or charts and graphs or TikToks that I've seen about people, that have an idea that they've been microchipped or, they're being tracked by the government, which is a conspiracy that we'll get into. We won't leave here today without talking about conspiracies too. So, but it's something that I thought was really interesting because almost all of them, with the exception of the news media, they kind of touch on constitutionality and civil liberties and rights, right? And like freedoms of the people. But you see that more on social media where people have access to creating the narrative. And so the narrative begins where people understand that their civil liberties are being infringed upon. So their understanding of the constitutional liberties that we have as citizens really starts to inform their rejection of federal mandates or their rejection of like state mandates. So I went and I did a little bit of digging because most of the TikToks and Snapchats and Facebook posts that I saw were like, you can't, like, don't tread on me. This is what I want. So I was like, let me do some digging because this cannot be the first time that this has happened. Like, we cannot, just have stumbled into like pandemic. Like, there has to be a historical precedence. And of course, like a good historian, I found them, right? I did like the digging. So there was an article that was circulating on Facebook that was like pro-vaccines. And they were saying, George Washington was the first president who like promoted inoculation of soldiers. And I was like, let's go check it out. Facebook world. And of course, like I went and I found like New England, like Journal of Medicine. I went to military history. I did all this research on like Walter Reed, trying to find like historical evidence that suggested, and in effect, like it was true. Like during George Washington's like primary campaign across the Potomac, he mandated during the Revolutionary War, like anybody who crossed through Philadelphia needed to be inoculated against smallpox because he found that most people were dying in the war, not from casualties related to the war, but that they were dying because they were being exposed to smallpox. So for him, it was about, I need my troops, I need my army, let's get you guys inoculated so you'll survive this war. And I was like, really? Think of it. So then I had, of course, had to do some research into like, what was an inoculation campaign like really like in the 18th century? Like, what would it look like? Bananas crazy. I don't know. Like if people don't want to get vaccinated today, they definitely wouldn't want to be inoculated back then because you basically, instead of like a shot that you would take, they would like cut open your skin. And I do have Erin here. She can tell me if I'm wrong or right. But the research said that in order to receive like, in order to promote the production of antiviral properties, you would basically create an incision in the skin and either put a piece of string or rub the area with a contaminated or some kind of like viral component, right? And then your body would create the natural defenses necessary. Yes? Woo! For smallpox, yes. So the research was correct. And so I thought, wow, that's really, really interesting because for a lot of people, you're like, George Washington, first president of the United States. We love him. He's awesome. But we don't want to like accept the fact that he was like, if he was alive today, he'd be like super pro-vax. He'd be like, go get your vaccinations. Let's do this. Like for him, he was like, everyone who crosses into Philadelphia will be vaccinated. I don't know. It was a really, really interesting stuff. And then there was actually a Supreme Court case in 1905. It's called Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which is like a seminal court case in terms of like public health. And the reason I say that is because it was the first case that looked at public health and looked at constitutionality. So basically the court case said, or the judges ruled that based upon a principle of self-defense, right? Like protection of people, the community has a right to protect itself against an epidemic, against a disease, which threatens the safety of its members, okay? So what we have here are people protesting, again, either getting some kind of inoculation for a smallpox outbreak. And there were like mask mandates and people were getting ticketed and arrested for not cooperating with mask mandates. And they would go to court and they say, I'm going to fight this ticket. I'm going to fight this. Like, you can't tell me to wear a mask. And the judge said, no, actually, what we're looking at here is like the safety and health and well-being of the whole. So what we want you to do is to participate because in terms of constitutionality, we want to protect the life, liberty, and happiness of the greater population. And I'm like, wow, this is fascinating, you guys. And then again, when we go again, this is the one that's kind of been brought up the most when we're looking at social media and when we're looking at newspapers, this 1918, 1919 influenza pandemic. And people are like, oh, well, we survived. Yes, but there was a mask ordinance back then, right? And so they would require people to wear masks in order to reduce transmission, very similarly to COVID-19, because influenza, it's like airborne, right? So particles, respiratory particles. And so they're like, wear a mask. But federal courts defer to municipal courts. Why? The reason I think that they did this is because there is no, at least back then, like there's no geographic, and today there is no geographic barrier, right? Like disease will spread because people travel and we touch and we leave things different places. So there's no way to effectively contain unless you quarantine or unless you stay at home. So I thought this was really interesting that federal courts left this in the hands of municipal judges to determine what was, when they voted like not to recall his governorship. And I think a lot of it has to do with this, but he, basically the governor of California, was sued by different religious groups that suggested that they didn't want to have to either mask, isolate, or receive vaccinations in order to congregate or be together in groups. And they felt that the state of California under these mandates was infringing upon their rights. Okay, so was the governor infringing upon the people's rights by saying you should not gather in large groups, you should be masked, or maybe perhaps you guys should vaccinate? And the people were like, yes, you're infringing upon my right to free movement, my right to do what I want. And so this goes all the way up to Supreme Court. And in the end, what the Supreme Court decides is that the courts have rights and responsibilities, okay? And as long as what they're asking isn't obscene and what they're asking is something that people can comply with, then they're going to make sure that the people are deferring to the greater good. Okay. So basically what we have here is a case of people v. people, right? People who are the kind of like greater good, like I'm not doing it for me, I'm doing it for those who can't. And then you have a group of people who are like, we want like civil liberties, which is a very individualized kind of like perspective, I think anyway. So the way that the Supreme Court justifies this, though, is saying that we are constantly looking and aware for abuses of power. So they don't want the governor to try and use or abuse more power than he has by asking people to participate in isolation or masks being worn and things like that, which led me to this court case, Koa versus Hogan. Fascinating, okay? So this is a court case that was brought to the attention of different groups, and it was essentially a group of military veterans who were refusing to mask, rightly so, like that's their constitutional right, is to question and ask. And so they essentially put together a claim in which they suggested that because of PTSD and something called subservience to captor, that they felt that masking was a problem for them and that there was limited adaptive or alternatives for them as victims or sufferers of PTSD during the pandemic. So basically their state wasn't doing enough to provide them with alternatives when mask mandates went out. And that mask mandate kind of like created mental health issues for this group of people. And so they were like, this is really a problem because it infringes on my civil liberties. My ability to move freely in society and enact my life as a citizen in everyday activities is being, how do you say, limited, or the government's not doing enough to protect my liberties by not offering alternatives for me because I suffer from, PTSD and this idea of subservience to captor. And ultimately, Supreme Court's ruled against this. And they said, well, actually, there is enough PPE alternatives in which, you can find an alternative, and the government is doing everything possible in order to make sure that each state has access to like a wide variety of PPE. Then there was another court case. This one goes back to 2016, which, just given the general climate and things that are going around on Facebook, this is something super huge that I saw had to do with constitutionality. And it was about healthcare workers who were losing their jobs. Let me frame this. The articles and the news presented the idea that healthcare workers were losing their jobs because of vaccine refusal, okay? And I found this court case, And it basically said, it was Spence versus Shaw, 2016. And it basically said that healthcare employers could require nurses to have flu shots, like back in 2016. And if you refused to have a flu shot, then you had to wear the appropriate PPE. And I'm just thinking about this because it's so huge right now. And in every single article or every single news or every single statement that I've seen, nobody references this court case, right? Nobody references like an actual instance in which healthcare workers took this to court and said, you know what, it should be my choice whether or not I elect to have this vaccine. And so it went and the judges evaluated it and they brought forth evidence and they had their arguments heard. And we were really kind of like questioning the constitutionality of like a person's right to choose. And nobody talks about this. And I was like, this is fascinating. Like, why are people talking about this? And then I just popped this up here. This is COVID-19 timeline, but we've all lived through it. So I think everybody kind of like has the general vibe that ever since like March, or even if you want to go back to November 2019, our lives have been kind of like subject to this huge COVID outbreak. And then I thought, okay, so if we're talking about constitutionality at a federal level, what's happening in the state of North Dakota? Because that's where we're at. Even if we're from different places, like we're subject to laws and the Constitution of North Dakota. So I was like, so what's happening? Well, on September 10th, like last week, Governor Burgum made like this huge caused, I guess you could say, like an uproar, or people were like cheering him on because he decided, he made this very public statement in which he basically said that he didn't believe that North Dakota would comply with Biden's executive order or mandates about how we're going to handle coronavirus or COVID during the pandemic. And so the CDC has specific guidelines. And as the pandemic has progressed, positive, negative, grown, shrunk, the CDC is constantly providing guidelines on what is the best way to proceed. And so President Biden is acting in accordance with the investigations and national trends, right? We're looking at big picture in order to create federal laws or federal recommendations for what people should do during the pandemic. And essentially, Governor Burgum said that even though the CDC has made these recommendations and President Biden stands behind them, he, as a state governor, will not be making any changes to our plan, like here in the state, okay? So, our COVID-19 pandemic emergency status, he revoked that like in April and decided, you know, we really have to consider what's best for us as at the state level, you know, and he's looking at cases and he's looking at numbers and he's trying to decipher like how is North Dakota managing the pandemic like itself, not within the national scope, but just itself. And so for him, he's basically saying like this national recommendation from the federal government does not apply to us because our numbers and our cases are decreasing and we are perfectly capable of handling our caseload. And so I think that that's really, really interesting because what's happening here is that the federal government is providing oversight for the nation. Meanwhile, Governor Burgum is saying that he is relying upon individual people to comply with their best judgment or to honor ideas of like masking if you feel sick, staying home if you feel sick, getting a vaccine if you're able and willing. And I think that he is placing this emphasis on like personal freedoms and like the responsibility of the individual, not necessarily acting kind of like thinking as a whole, which brought me to this idea of we the people, okay? Because when we're looking at the Constitution, that's where we start. I don't know if anybody had to memorize the opening lines of the Constitution. Anybody? I saw that was like a thing in high school, or at least in debate or speech. A lot of people had to memorize like the first 8 lines of the Constitution, like we the people in order to form a more just nation, do seek, right? So it's like this whole kind of like basically in this first preamble, we're outlining the goals and what we want to accomplish with the creation of the Constitution, a more perfect nation. Liberty, you know, all of these things, freedom of property, they're all outlined in the very first 8 lines of the Constitution. But what's interesting here is that we're talking we the people, us. But nothing has created more division amongst the people than living through a pandemic. And I'm like, this is crazy. This is wild, right? So then it got me thinking about this idea of the greater good. So basically what we're seeing here in terms of constitutionality and what we're looking at is individual freedoms versus a standing majority. And just based upon the things that I looked at, that I found that people were saying in online chat forums, on academic Twitter, in legal journals, like I went on Harvard Law Review, people are suing the US government for infringing upon their freedoms by, posting mask mandates and closing small businesses. Like, people are exercising like legislative rights in order to assure that their civil liberties, or at least questioning whether or not their civil liberties are being infringed upon. Like, we don't talk about that, but there are people who are taking the government to court questioning, like, can you do this? Are you in violation of my constitutional rights by doing these things? And so there are people who are questioning whether or not living through a pandemic does kind of like repress our individual freedoms. And it's individual freedoms and things like, if you're like, what does that mean? Well, autonomy of movement, right? Can we move between states freely? Do you need to have a COVID test to travel to another country? Can they do that to you, right? What about businesses shutting down, like small business shutdown, or the closing of restaurants, or limiting them to 50% capacity or 75% capacity, right? All of that, people say, like, has an impact upon our individual freedoms. And then the last thing is like the curtailing of gatherings, right? Where we're saying no more than so many can gather at any given time. It's why like churches were closed for a long time. And then when they opened, they said, don't sing. Or restaurants, like I said, were at 30% capacity. Some schools even enacted like an A-B day where they would have students come, every other day to school. And it was really the idea of like limiting the number of people who were together. And people were questioning this, like, can you really like limit my movement as an individual, like in society? And this kind of went against like a standing majority. So if you had to think about it, I would say like states' rights versus federal rights, or individual versus groups. And the standing majority really emphasized this idea that we are in the middle of a public health emergency. And no matter how many times they said this, like public health emergency, pandemic, we still kind of like went back to this idea of individual freedoms and whether or not those were being kind of like infringed upon. And I think that a lot of that had to do with disinformation, right? I don't know any other moment in time in which people have studied or claim to have studied and know about the Constitution and constitutional rights that aren't lawyers or historians or social workers or government employees. But like all of a sudden, everybody is like, my constitutional rights. It's like, which ones? What are you? You know what I mean? Where it's like, we're all experts suddenly. And then this idea of a common good, where we're saying, this is a public health emergency and we need to consider the common good. And this idea of acting personal responsibility for a common good, it really created a divide amongst like the American people, where people were like, wait. So I have a personal responsibility to provide for the common good. And people were like, whoa, like, I'm just going to do me. I don't know how many times, like, you do whatever you want to do. I'm going to do what I want to do. And but it's a public health emergency. It's all of us, right? So it's kind of like this idea where all of a sudden we the people, but then it's like, what people? Like, we the people who do and we the people who don't? Or all of a sudden we're we the people who focus on individual freedoms and we the people who focus on the common good. So it kind of like made me question, like, what is happening, right? So on that same train of thought came the COVID-19 conspiracies. And if you're taking my History 224 American Studies, we study conspiracy theories, and we look at the way that psychologically and sociologically humans kind of like adhere to conspiracy theories as a way to explain the world around them, okay? So how do conspiracy theories tell us about people's understanding of the world that they live in? And this is a perfect example, okay? Because we can look at it historically, and we can always find some kind of political, social, or economic background that fuels conspiracy theories. And I would hope that anybody who's listening online doesn't dismiss this when I say conspiracy theory, because some people are like, oh, they're just a bunch of nut jobs. No. But like, we have to think that this has origins somewhere. Like this is like a very broad, wide set kind of like cultural phenomenon. Okay. Conspiracy theories, like we have to like give them some credit and like look into them. I think like they're worth it. And so when it came to look into the COVID-19 conspiracy, I don't cover this one in my class, but I think like in the future I might, because there's like 3 large conspiracy theories that are directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. And the first one is this idea that COVID-19 is a government-led experiment, right? And from there, you have like all these subsequent like minor conspiracies, that it's a project in social control, as if it were like the Sanford experiment. Like, what can we get people to comply with because we're the government? Okay. Like, what can we get people to do? Can we get them to mask up? Can we get them to stay home? Can we get them to do this if we say that there is a public health emergency? That's one kind of like offshoot of this idea of government-led. The second was this idea that the pandemic was a way to get people out to vote. That is to say that some people said that COVID-19 was going to end right after the election. That once we had a new president elected, they would choose whether or not COVID-19 was going to continue to be a national emergency, a global like pandemic. Like they would somehow, as leader of the free world, be able to kind of like eliminate or eradicate or somehow make it all go away. Okay. So this is like another conspiracy. And another one that was government led said that it was really tragically and sadly like a weird form of like euthanasia, where we were kind of, or eugenics, where we were trying, not euthanasia, well, kind of, but eugenics, in which we were trying to create like population control. And this was like there is a wide set group of people who believe that the government is trying to control the population by kind of like unleashing this global pandemic, and like the way that we're handling it is a form of population control. Listen, I'm just telling you, I'm just the voice. I'm just telling you what I found, that this is like very, another COVID-19 conspiracy is that this is all geared by big pharma. And that suggests that these large companies that invest money into the development of vaccines and the distribution of vaccines, that they are benefiting from the creation or the existence of a public health emergency, right? So that this is a way to fuel the domestic economy and global trade by creating vaccines to treat a worldwide epidemic. That's the idea, right? Is that, oh, this is just big pharma, like they need to make money, so we create a pandemic and then we need vaccines. I mean, you do you, whatever you want. And then the last and perhaps most intriguing of the conspiracy theories was this idea that Bill Gates had created a microchip. Jacob, I see you nodding. Did you hear this one? You're laughing. Okay. So this idea that Bill Gates had invented and created a microchip, and that acting on behalf of the US government had somehow placed this microchip inside the COVID vaccine, so that every time, everybody's laughing back there, every time somebody was vaccinated, you would be tracked, right? And so much like your dog's microchip that gives a GPS location and tells you like where you are and who you belong to, this idea that the government was somehow microchipping us in order to track us and track our health, and like kind of like the non-census census, like don't answer the door for the census guy, doesn't matter because you've been microchipped. It's kind of like that. At least that's what I think. Yeah. And so from this, that's where you saw those people who were like, the spoon sticks on my arm, there's a microchip, like where I got the vaccine. Like, oh yeah. I mean, Nick's like, are you serious? Yeah, there's like a bunch of people online who had videos and they were sticking spoons to their arms saying that they had like a magnet in there, and like it's evidence like supposedly of like this conspiracy on behalf of like Silicon Valley and like tech agencies. Personally, because I do teach this in my conspiracy theories class, when we're talking about digital security and Edward Snowden and the NSA and ways of like tracking Americans, I'm like, y'all have a cell phone. That's That's all they need. You're doing that to yourself. So I don't really think it's like a big thing to like, let's microchip everyone. But these are just like the common conspiracies that come out of. And when you think about it, we need to find a way to explain. And not all of us are virologists, and not all of us are biologists, and not all of us study healthcare and public health and pandemics, right? So not having a familiarity with the science of what's happening here lends itself for people to rely on things that they do know, okay? Things like, well, is the government capable of orchestrating or creating an ideology that people will believe? If the government says there is a public health emergency, will people believe there is a public health emergency? And conspiracy theorists would be like, yes, the government is capable of that. So herein lies the conspiracy. Or if there's people who have a connection to big pharma and they're like, yes, I go to Walgreens. Yes, I go to CVS. Like, I know that there is an industry out there that produces millions and billions of dollars worth of medical care and goods that make it so that I can live. So maybe they would turn against us and they would need more money. So they are going to create a vaccine. So what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to conspiracy theories, we don't know the science, right, behind pandemics. And we don't know the science behind a virus, or we don't know the science behind genetic mutations of viruses. We're very at the basic level of cough into your elbow to avoid getting others sick. We're cover your face. If you're sick, stay home. Like, we're at a very basic kind of like level of understanding. But we rely on past information or information that we have that is plausible to us in order to make sense of what's happening in the world around us. So we all have cell phones and technology, and it basically controls and dominates our everyday life, right? You're always on your cell phone. You're always checking your email. So why would it seem so outrageous that the government or Bill Gates would want to track your every move by creating a microchip and putting a probably $100 microchip in your arm to find out like what you're doing and what you're thinking? Like, doesn't seem that crazy, right? Now, I know that in essence, and if you're here and you're like, wait, I thought this was like Constitution Day talk. Constitution Day basically is about commemorating the ratification of the Constitution. We did it. We became independent. Like, we created an article like of government in order to organize our freedoms. Yes. And then we also commemorate the people who choose to become US citizens. So people who are naturalized and who like come here and we're like, yes, be a part of the United States. Yes. But at the same time, I feel like it's a great opportunity to look at the Constitution, and especially now, like in this kind of like day and age that we're living in, when people are saying and relying upon this argument and this idea of the constitutionality of the world that we live in, and they're constantly questioning it. I thought, why not bring it up? Like, I've heard so many people say, my rights, my body, my privilege, my this. And I'm like, okay, then let's get informed upon your constitutional rights. Let's get informed upon that, Article 10, states' rights. Because we have so much public debate and so much personal debate. I've seen arguments between family members, arguments between friends, like arguments between coworkers. So I feel like this is something that is relevant and interesting, and it really does have to do with, for some people, the constitutionality of like the world we're living in, right? So the next time that you hear somebody say, my rights, the Constitution gives me freedoms, think about kind of like just a couple of the ideas that I talked about today, right? Like what the Constitution's purpose is, what kind of liberties and individual freedoms it's supposed to protect. And then think of it as a guiding principle for like the greater good, okay? So when we're talking about the difference between mandates and requests, there is no, and maybe this is just like a personal, there is no violation of human freedoms in the sense that nobody is like locking you in your home or forcing you to do, right? It's just about making choices. And when the Constitution was created, we created it with the idea that we're entering into a social contract, right? So the government will provide certain freedoms for you in exchange with your compliance on, you want protection from foreign incursion, we'll create a military. You want protections under the law, we'll create a legislative branch. You want to be able to defend your rights, we'll create, courts where you can question whether or not something that's happening to you is legal or not, right? So we accept the Constitution as a governing document, okay? But in accepting it and living here, we have to accept the fact that there are certain obligations that we as citizens of this nation have to comply with. And I feel like that's something that we tend to forget often. And when I was looking at this, I'll just close with this. There was an article that was posted in the Jamestown Sun just last week or something. And it was this guy, Mike Jacobs. And if you've ever read the Botno paper, he talks about the Constitution. This is a common article where he dissects the Constitution. He's a constitutionalist, historian, and political scientist. So he's always looking at the Constitution. And he wrote this article, and the article said, North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum should consider the Constitution. And I was like, oh, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, okay? That's exactly what I'm saying. Because if we're thinking about the preamble and what we're talking about in the Constitution, do we want to form a more perfect union? Do we want justice? Do we want domestic tranquility? Do we want to promote general welfare? Do we want common defense? And do we want the blessings of liberty for everyone who lives in the United States? If that's the case, that's the crux of the Constitution, then how do we make that work when we're people versus people living in an era of pandemic? Just a thought, just a little interesting question that I thought I'd put out there for Constitution Day. So I'll just open it up and see if you guys have any comments or questions that I can answer, but it's just something that's been on my mind. So I thought I'd share it with everyone here. So does anybody have any questions or any comments, concerns? Oh, thanks. Yeah, I just always feel like we could talk about the articles and how the Constitution was written, but there's so many more pressing current ideas that surround the Constitution. We're not thinking about the Constitution on a daily basis, but people are talking about it on a daily basis. So I think that that's really interesting. I don't know.
Versus the United States, where we're an individualistic thought process rather than
for collective. Okay. Yeah, which is crazy because, and I was trying to explain this to Dr. Albrightson, when I'm talking the people versus the people, you can interchange and exchange that so easily, right? So when we say the people versus the people of the United States, is it individual freedoms versus collective good? Or is it people who say they want the collective good, but what they're really vying for is individual freedoms, right? So I kind of think of it as one of those Russian nesting dolls where it's one thing over the other, and we're opening it, trying to find out what is at the center of this, And I agree with you because I think that's something that we don't talk about when it comes to mandates is this idea of privilege, right? So I grew up in a territory, a colony of the United States, and so we comply to federal rules, but we have no federal protections. So that is to say that in Puerto Rico, we abide by the laws of the federal government, but we don't benefit from any of the federal protections that a state would. So we don't have states' rights. And so for me, it's really interesting to talk about things like public health and welfare when women in the 1970s were forcibly sterilized against their will in Puerto Rico as part of experiments for Big Pharma. So, I think it's incredibly interesting to talk about the cultural implications of privilege, right? And how people who have always had access to healthcare, when it comes time to trust that healthcare and that science that you have believed forever, right? At what point and what juncture does science not rule? At what point do we become the scientists? I'm not a scientist. I would never say that I'm going to not defer to the expertise of a scientist or a virologist or immunologist. That's their job. And to suggest that an entire medical community who went to 4 years of undergrad and then medical school and then a residency and then that they don't know what they're saying. I mean, it's kind of like, it's wild, right? I mean, I don't know. I've seen a commercial and it was like, oh, you know, I'm gonna go take my car to a mechanic and the mechanic's gonna be like, oh yeah, I saw a video on YouTube about how to do this one time. It's like, you would never leave your car there. So why are you watching videos on YouTube to explain like your personal health? I don't know. It's wild, but it's fascinating in terms of social behavior and the way that people, like their thought process and political beliefs shape their actions. Fascinating. For like a social behavior scientist, this is incredibly fascinating to live through a pandemic. Like most people will be like, ooh, but I don't know. I think it's very interesting to see how people in a position of privilege react to kind of like having all of the wealth of knowledge and still being like, nah, science. What? It's crazy, but it's fascinating. I don't know. Anybody else?
As a further example or a different example of cultural differences, wasn't there a reservation in Minnesota that had some very severe limitations on movement? But people had to have a really good reason to get out of their house. And if they did, they'd be escorted back home if they didn't. And I understand they had one of the lowest rates of infection in the country.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the global examples that I follow closely is New Zealand. And if you haven't followed New Zealand's response to the global pandemic, it's fascinating. They went on immediate lockdown and they're incredibly restrictive in terms of like their behavior. But then they also, everyone's hanging out right now. We are struggling with like second, third waves, and everybody in New Zealand's just like partying it up because they are complying with like testing and mask mandates and stay-at-home orders. And I think that it's really interesting because the way that we kind of like participate or decide to engage really affects like in the longue durée, like how long this is gonna last. People are like, I'm so sick of this, how long is it gonna last? And it's like, well, yeah, if we just would have done what we were supposed to do, you know? And it's so funny because I don't know if this is true. Nick's here so he can confirm or deny. In Canada, they had really strict restrictions in terms of movement during the COVID pandemic. Is it true? I heard a story that you were out working fields and that the RCMP came out to check to make sure that.
Yeah, they did that.
So they were like checking because you weren't in your home.
Yeah.
And you weren't supposed to be working your fields.
Yeah, basically. But I was all on my own, so.
Yeah, see, and I think that's fascinating, right? So we don't have that same kind of like judicial response or executive response to stay-at-home orders. Like everybody's like, in Canada, like they're checking on farmers who are plowing their fields. Like nobody would stop you and say like, what are you doing outside of your house? So I don't know. It's very, very interesting to say like people say like, you can't limit my movement. Nobody did. We just said, don't, please, you know? So I just think it's very, very interesting. And this is a fascinating case study. So we'll see where we are next year. Like, I'm sure there'll be like another kind of like constitutional way we can explore. There'll be something new. Maybe we'll do constitutional conspiracy theories next year. I'm not sure. So we'll see. But thank you guys so much for coming. It's so fun to talk about. So I appreciate you guys for coming, students and faculty and staff. So